Marcus Rivera knelt in the mud, his weathered hands trembling as he cradled the injured German Shepherd mix. Blood matted the dog's golden fur, and its breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the abandoned lot into a swamp of broken concrete and rusted metal. Around him, 6 other strays huddled beneath whatever scraps of shelter they could find. A piece of corrugated metal, an old tarp, the skeletal remains of a burnt-out car. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had been sleeping rough in this forgotten corner of Portland for 8 months now, ever since the nightmares made it impossible to keep a roof over his head. The sounds of helicopters overhead, the smell of diesel fuel, the weight of memories from 2 tours in Afghanistan, they followed him everywhere. But somehow, in the company of these abandoned dogs, the ghosts seemed quieter. The animals didn't ask questions about his past, didn't look at him with pity or fear. They simply existed alongside him, survivors recognizing survivors. The shepherd whimpered, and Marcus felt his chest tighten. He had been a medic in the army, trained to save lives under impossible conditions. But here, with no supplies and no money, he felt helpless. The nearest animal hospital was 12 miles away, and even if he could carry the injured dog that far, he had nothing to pay for treatment. His disability check barely covered food for himself, let alone veterinary bills. He looked around the lot again, taking inventory of what little they had. A few plastic bowls he'd found behind a restaurant, some blankets donated by a church group, a shopping cart filled with whatever supplies he could scavenge or afford. It wasn't much, but it was home. The dogs had started following him weeks ago, drawn perhaps by his steady presence or the scraps of food he shared despite his own hunger. There was Duchess, an elderly pit bull with scars across her muzzle and eyes that held too much wisdom. Bear, a massive mastiff mix who looked fierce but cowered at loud noises. Luna, a black lab who had shown up pregnant and given birth to 4 puppies under the rusted shell of an old truck. And now this shepherd, whose collar was too worn to read, but whose eyes still held a spark of trust despite everything. Marcus made a decision. He couldn't save them all, but he could try to save this one. He wrapped the dog carefully in his own jacket, the only clean thing he owned, and began the long walk toward the main road. Maybe someone would help. Maybe a passing driver would take pity on them both. But as he reached the chain-link fence that bordered the lots, something made him pause. A black sedan was parked across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the gray sky. Marcus had noticed it before. Always the same car, always in a different spot, but always watching. His military training kicked in, the paranoia that had kept him alive in hostile territory but made civilian life unbearable. He stepped back into the shadows of the lot, still holding the injured dog. Whoever was watching him could wait. Right now, this animal needed him, and Marcus Rivera might not have much left to give to the world, but he still remembered how to fight for something worth saving. The German Shepherd's condition worsened overnight. Marcus stayed awake, using techniques he'd learned in field medicine to keep the animal stable, pressure on wounds, keeping the dog warm, monitoring breathing patterns. But without proper supplies or antibiotics, he knew it was only a matter of time. By morning, desperation had replaced caution. He loaded the dog into his shopping cart, cushioned by every blanket and towel he could find, and began the journey toward town. The other dogs followed at a distance, sensing something was wrong. Duchess limped alongside the cart, her graying muzzle nudging Marcus's hand whenever he slowed down. Bear brought up the rear, his massive frame serving as a gentle guardian for Luna's puppies. They made an odd procession down the cracked sidewalks of Portland's industrial district. Marcus, unshaven and hollow-eyed, pushing a shopping cart containing a barely conscious dog while a pack of strays formed an honor guard around him. People crossed the street to avoid them. Cars slowed down, windows rolling up. A few took pictures with their phones, probably for social media posts about the city's homeless problem. But Marcus pressed on, driven by something stronger than embarrassment or pride. In Afghanistan, he had taken an oath to preserve life. That oath hadn't expired when he came home broken and struggling to sleep without pharmaceutical help. It hadn't been voided when the VA counselor told him he needed to adjust his expectations about recovery. It certainly hadn't been canceled when his landlord evicted him for missing rent, while he spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric ward. The veterinary clinic on Morrison Street had a bright blue sign and a parking lot full of expensive cars. Through the glass doors, Marcus could see families with purebred puppies, elderly women with perfectly groomed cats, children holding hamster cages. His reflection in the window showed him what they would see: a homeless veteran with wild hair and clothes that hadn't been washed in weeks, carrying in a dying animal that probably had no owner and no means of payment. But the German Shepherd's breathing had become more labored, and Marcus knew they were running out of time. He pushed through the front door, shopping cart and all, trailing mud across the pristine floor. Conversation stopped. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly applied makeup, looked up from her computer with barely concealed alarm. "Sir, you can't bring that cart in here," she said, her voice tight with professional politeness. Marcus lifted the dog from the cart, cradling the animal against his chest. "Please," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "This dog is dying. I don't have money, but—" "Sir, this is a private practice. If you're looking for low-cost services, the animal shelter on Powell has a clinic that—" "There isn't time." Marcus stepped closer to the reception desk. The dog's breathing had become shallow, labored. "Please, I was a medic. I know what internal bleeding looks like. This animal won't survive another hour without treatment." The receptionist glanced toward the back of the clinic, then at the other customers, who were watching the scene with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "I'm sorry, but without proof of ownership or ability to pay." A man in scrubs emerged from one of the examination rooms, drawn by the commotion. Dr. James Chen was young, maybe early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He took one look at the dog in Marcus's arms and stepped forward. "Bring him back," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Doctor, he doesn't have," the receptionist began. "Bring him back," Dr. Chen repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus followed the veterinarian into a sterile examination room, gently placing the German Shepherd on the metal table. Under the bright lights, the extent of the dog's injuries became clear. Multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding, signs of malnutrition and parasites. This wasn't just the result of one accident. This animal had been suffering for weeks, maybe months. Dr. Chen worked quickly, his hands sure and gentle as he examined the dog. Marcus found himself assisting instinctively, holding the animal steady, anticipating what the doctor would need next. For a moment, the small room felt like a field hospital, two medics working together to save a life. "You said you were a medic," Dr. Chen said as he prepared an IV line. "Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan." Marcus kept his eyes on the dog. "This one's been through hell." "So have you, I'd guess." The doctor's voice was quiet, non-judgmental. "What's the dog's name?" Marcus paused. He'd been thinking of the shepherd as the injured one, or the German shepherd, but naming implied ownership, responsibility, hope for a future. "Ranger," he said finally. "His name is—" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Ranger. Dr. Chen smiled slightly. "Good name. Military working dog?" "Don't know. Found him yesterday, bleeding in the lot where we've been staying." Marcus hesitated, then added, "There are others. 6 more dogs, living rough like me. They're not hurt like this one, but they need help too." The examination took nearly an hour. Ranger had 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, severe dehydration, and a host of other problems that spoke to months of neglect and abuse. But he was young, maybe 2 years old, and his heart was strong. With proper treatment, Dr. Chen explained, he had a good chance of recovery. "It's going to be expensive," the doctor warned. "Surgery, medications, boarding while he heals. We're talking several $1,000s." Marcus felt his hope deflate. Several $1,000s might as well have been several million. "How long does he have if we don't do the surgery?" "Without treatment? Maybe 6 hours, maybe less." Marcus nodded slowly. He'd known this was coming, but it still hit him like a physical blow. In Afghanistan, he'd saved dozens of lives because he'd had the tools, the support, the resources of the world's most advanced military. Here, in his own country, he was powerless to save one injured dog. "There might be another option," Dr. Chen said carefully. "I know someone who helps with cases like this. Animal rescue situations, veterans in need. Would you be willing to talk to them?" Marcus looked down at Ranger, whose breathing had stabilized slightly with the oxygen mask. "What would I have to do?" "Nothing you wouldn't want to do. Just tell your story. Let them help." Dr. Chen was already reaching for his phone. "Her name is Sarah Martinez, and she runs a foundation that—" "No!" Marcus stepped back from the table. "No foundations, no charity cases, no pity donations. It's not like that. It's always like that." Marcus's voice carried the weight of every well-meaning social worker, every condescending case manager, every volunteer who wanted to help the homeless veteran as their good deed for the day. "I'll figure something out." But even as he said it, Marcus knew there was nothing to figure out. He had no money, no resources, no way to pay for Ranger's treatment. And outside, 6 other dogs were waiting for him to come back, depending on him to keep them safe in a world that saw them as nothing more than problems to be solved or removed. Dr. Chen watched him for a moment, then made a decision. "I'll tell you what. I'll start the surgery now, stabilize him, get him through the next few days. You don't owe me anything yet. But while he's recovering, I want you to think about accepting some help. Not charity. Help. There's a difference." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to maintain what little dignity he had left. But Ranger's breathing was getting weaker, and pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Okay," he said quietly. "Thank you." As Dr. Chen prepared for surgery, Marcus stepped outside to check on the other dogs. They were still there, waiting patiently in the parking lot despite the stares and complaints from other customers. Duchess had positioned herself near the front door, as if standing guard. Bear was lying down, letting Luna's puppies climb over his massive frame. They looked up expectantly when Marcus appeared, hoping for good news he didn't have. "He's going to be okay," Marcus told them, hoping it was true, "but we need to figure some things out." That evening, Marcus sat in the clinic's waiting room long after closing time. Dr. Chen had given him permission to stay, understanding that leaving meant abandoning not just Ranger but the pack of dogs who refused to go anywhere without their human. The surgery had gone well, but Ranger would need several days of monitoring and care. Marcus dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable plastic chair, jerking awake every time a car passed by outside or the building's heating system kicked on. His dreams were full of helicopters and explosions, but also of dogs, injured animals he couldn't save, creatures depending on him for protection he couldn't provide. Around midnight, he heard a key in the front door. Dr. Chen entered, carrying coffee and a bag from a nearby fast food restaurant. "Thought you might be hungry," the doctor said, handing Marcus the bag. Marcus accepted the food gratefully. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a full meal. "How is he?" "Stable. Better than I expected, honestly. He's a fighter." Dr. Chen settled into the chair next to Marcus. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about not wanting charity." Marcus tensed, waiting for another lecture about accepting help. "I have a proposition for you," Dr. Chen continued. "My clinic sponsors a mobile veterinary unit that serves underserved communities. We're short-staffed, and we could use someone with medical training to help with basic care, wound cleaning, administering medications, monitoring vital signs. It's not a handout. It's a job. I don't have an address, no phone, no way for people to reach me. We'll figure that out. The point is, you'd be earning the money to pay for Ranger's treatment, and you'd be helping other animals in the process. Animals whose owners are in situations similar to yours." Marcus considered this. Work meant structure, purpose, a reason to get up in the morning that didn't involve just surviving another day. But it also meant stability he wasn't sure he could maintain, expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. "What about the others?" he asked, gesturing toward the parking lot where the dogs were sleeping under a streetlight. "What about them?" "They need help too. Proper food, medical care, somewhere safe to stay. I can't just abandon them." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "The mobile unit serves a lot of areas where people can't afford traditional veterinary care. Homeless camps, low-income neighborhoods, rural areas. If you're willing to work with us, we could extend those services to include stray animals, feral colonies, situations like yours. It sounded too good to be true, which in Marcus's experience meant it probably was. But Ranger was alive because Dr. Chen had been willing to take a risk on both of them. Maybe it was time for Marcus to return the favor. When would I start? Next week. Give Ranger time to recover, give you time to think it over. There's one more thing, though. Dr. Chen hesitated. The mobile unit operates out of a facility on the east side of town. It's on private property, owned by someone who's very supportive of animal welfare causes. You'd be working on their land. Something in the doctor's tone made Marcus suspicious. Who owns the property? Someone who prefers to stay anonymous. They've been very generous with their support, but they value their privacy. Marcus had learned to recognize evasion, and Dr. Chen was definitely hiding something. But Ranger needed ongoing care, and the other dogs needed help that Marcus couldn't provide on his own. Sometimes the best choice was the only choice available. I'll think about it, Marcus said. The next morning brought complications Marcus hadn't anticipated. He woke up in the clinic's waiting room to find a police officer standing over him, hand resting casually on his nightstick. "Sir, you need to move along," the officer said. "There've been complaints about the dogs outside, and the business next door says you've been here all night." Marcus stood slowly, his back aching from sleeping in the plastic chair. Through the front window, he could see that a small crowd had gathered around the dogs. Some people were taking pictures, others were on their phones. Bear had positioned himself protectively in front of Luna's puppies, while Duchess sat alert and watchful. "The dogs aren't bothering anyone," Marcus said. "They're just waiting. They're creating a disturbance, and this is private property. You can't just camp out here." Dr. Chen appeared from the back of the clinic, still wearing yesterday's scrubs. "Officer Martinez, is there a problem?" "Got calls about a homeless man with a pack of stray dogs causing problems. Business owners are concerned about their customers." "This man brought an injured animal in for emergency surgery," Dr. Chen explained calmly. "He's been waiting for news about the dog's condition. There's no law against that." Officer Martinez looked skeptical. "And the other dogs? Are on public property, not bothering anyone, and have as much right to exist as any other animal in this city." Marcus watched the exchange with growing unease. He'd had enough encounters with police officers over the past 8 months to know how these situations usually ended. Sometimes it was a citation for loitering or public camping. Sometimes it was a night in jail. Sometimes it was worse. But Dr. Chen seemed to have some influence with Officer Martinez, because after a few more minutes of conversation, the policeman agreed to give them more time to figure out a solution. 24 hours, he said to Marcus. "After that, you need to find somewhere else to be." After the officer left, Dr. Chen turned to Marcus with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry. I didn't think this would become such a public spectacle." "Not your fault." Marcus looked outside, where more people had gathered. Someone was setting up what looked like a small news camera. "How's Ranger?" "Better. Much better. He was awake this morning, alert. I think we can move him to the recovery area later today." Dr. Chen paused. "Have you thought any more about the job offer?" Marcus had been thinking about little else. The mobile veterinary unit represented a chance to do meaningful work again, to use his skills in service of something larger than his own survival. But it also meant leaving the lot where he'd been living, abandoning the small sense of home he'd managed to create. "The facility you mentioned," Marcus said, "is there housing available for employees?" "There might be. Why?" Marcus gestured toward the dogs outside. "Because I'm not going anywhere without them. And if someone's willing to hire a homeless veteran, maybe they'd be willing to help house some homeless animals too." Dr. Chen smiled. "I think that can be arranged." The drive to the facility took them through parts of Portland Marcus had never seen. They left the industrial downtown area and headed east, past shopping centers and subdivisions, into rolling hills dotted with expensive homes and horse properties. Dr. Chen drove while Marcus sat in the passenger seat, Ranger sleeping peacefully in a carrier in the back. The other dogs followed in a donated animal control van, courtesy of an officer who'd been moved by their story after it appeared on the local news. Bear, Duchess, Luna, and the puppies were getting their first ride in a vehicle, and Marcus could see their confusion and anxiety through the van's windows. "Tell me about the person who owns this place," Marcus said as they turned onto a private road flanked by towering evergreens. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. I don't like walking into situations blind." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "They're very wealthy. They made their fortune in business, but they've always been passionate about animal welfare. They fund rescue operations, sponsor veterinary clinics, support legislation for animal protection. They're also very private." "How private?" "Private enough that I signed a non-disclosure agreement before I was allowed to work here." Marcus felt his old paranoia stirring. "What kind of business?" "The kind that's made them one of the most successful people in the Pacific Northwest." "But Marcus, I need you to understand something. This person has already done more for animals than most people could do in 10 lifetimes. Whatever reservations you have about accepting help, put them aside. This isn't charity. This is someone who recognizes talent and wants to put it to good use." The road wound through carefully maintained forest for nearly 2 miles before opening into a clearing that took Marcus's breath away. The main house was a modern masterpiece of glass and steel, built into the hillside as if it had grown there naturally. But it was the outbuildings that caught his attention. A state-of-the-art veterinary hospital, large kennels and dog runs, what looked like a rehabilitation center for wildlife, and several smaller structures that might have been housing for staff. The mobile veterinary unit was parked near the hospital, a gleaming RV outfitted with examination equipment and surgical capabilities. Marcus had seen nothing like it during his time on the streets, where injured animals often went without care simply because their owners couldn't afford treatment or transportation to a clinic. "This is incredible," Marcus said quietly. "Wait until you see inside." They parked near the veterinary hospital, and Marcus helped transfer Ranger to a recovery room that was better equipped than most human hospitals he'd seen. The other dogs were brought to a spacious kennel area, where they could stay together while adjusting to their new surroundings. Luna's puppies immediately began exploring every corner of their temporary home, while Duchess and Bear positioned themselves where they could keep watch over the group. "They'll be comfortable here while you get settled," Dr. Chen assured him. "There's staff housing about a quarter mile up the hill, mole apartments for employees who work closely with the animals." Marcus followed him up a winding path to a cluster of modest but well-appointed cabins. Each had a small porch, a view of the surrounding forest, and enough space for someone to live simply but comfortably. Dr. Chen opened the door to one that had been prepared for occupancy, furnished with basic necessities, stocked with food, equipped with everything someone might need to start over. "This is yours if you want it," Dr. Chen said. "The job comes with housing, health insurance, and a salary that should be more than enough to cover your needs and Ranger's ongoing care." Marcus walked through the small apartment, touching surfaces that were clean and solid, opening cabinets stocked with supplies he hadn't been able to afford in months. There was a shower with hot water, a bed with clean sheets, a kitchen where he could prepare real meals. It felt like stepping into someone else's life. "What's the catch?" he asked finally. "No catch. Just hard work. And a commitment to helping animals who need it most." Marcus stood at the window, looking down at the veterinary facility where his dogs were settling in. After months of sleeping rough, of never knowing where the next meal would come from, of watching animals suffer because he couldn't help them, this felt like a dream. But dreams had a way of turning into nightmares, especially when they seemed too good to be true. "I want to meet the owner," he said. Dr. Chen hesitated. "That's not usually how things work here." "Then this isn't going to work. I've spent too many months being shuffled around by people who make decisions about my life without ever bothering to look me in the eye. If someone wants me to work on their property, live in their housing, take care of their animals, then they can damn well introduce themselves." There was a long silence. Then Dr. Chen pulled out his phone and made a brief call, speaking too quietly for Marcus to overhear. When he hung up, he was smiling. "Someone will be down to meet you in an hour," he said. "I think you're going to be surprised." Marcus spent the hour getting acquainted with the mobile veterinary unit. It was equipped with everything he could have imagined. Digital X-ray equipment, surgical instruments, medications that cost more than most people made in a month. There was a computer system for tracking patient records, a GPS unit for navigating to remote locations, even a small refrigeration unit for storing vaccines and other temperature-sensitive supplies. He was examining the surgical equipment when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see Dr. Chen returning with his mysterious employer, but instead found himself facing a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she'd been working with animals all day. "You must be Marcus," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Elena Harrison." Marcus shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of physical work. "Ms. Harrison." "Just Elena. I understand you're interested in working with the mobile unit." "I'm interested in meeting the person who owns this place." Elena smiled. "You're looking at her." Marcus blinked, processing this information. Elena Harrison didn't look like the billionaire business owner he'd been expecting. She looked like someone who spent her days caring for animals, someone who understood the value of hard work and practical solutions. "Dr. Chen said you made your fortune in business," Marcus said carefully. "Pet food business. Started with a small company that made natural dog treats, ended up building one of the largest pet nutrition companies in North America." Elena gestured toward the mobile unit. "Turns out there's good money in keeping animals healthy and happy." Marcus felt something click into place. "Harrison Pet Foods. That's the one. I sold the company 5 years ago and decided to spend my retirement doing something more meaningful than sitting on a beach somewhere." Elena looked around the facility with obvious pride. "This is my real work now." The knowledge that he was standing in front of Elena Harrison, whose company's products he'd seen in every grocery store and pet shop in the country, should have been intimidating. But there was something so straightforward about her, so unpretentious, that Marcus found himself relaxing for the first time in months. "Dr. Chen tells me you've been living rough," Elena continued. "You and several dogs who've attached themselves to you." Something like that. "He also tells me you're a veteran with medical training, that you've been taking care of these animals despite having no resources to work with." Elena studied his face carefully. "That tells me something about your character." Marcus wasn't sure how to respond to that. Character was a luxury he hadn't been able to afford lately. Most days he'd been focused on simple survival. "I want to offer you a job," Elena continued. "Not because I feel sorry for you, but because I need someone with your skills and your instincts." The mobile unit serves communities where people love their animals but can't afford traditional veterinary care. It takes someone special to do that work, someone who understands what it means to be forgotten by the system. What exactly would I be doing? Everything. Basic medical care, wound treatment, vaccinations, spay and neuter procedures, emergency response. We'd train you on the equipment, get you certified for the procedures you haven't done before, partner you with veterinarians who can handle the complex cases. It sounded like exactly the kind of work Marcus had dreamed of doing. Meaningful, challenging, directly helpful to both animals and people who needed it most. But he'd learned to be suspicious of good fortune. "Why me?" he asked. "You could hire someone with formal veterinary training, someone without the complications I bring." Elena was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. 20 years ago, I was where you are now. Not homeless, but broken in other ways. I'd lost my husband, my business was failing, I was drinking too much and sleeping too little. I had a dog then, an old German shepherd named Rex, who'd been with me through everything." She paused, looking out toward the kennels where Marcus's dogs were resting. "Rex got sick, needed expensive surgery I couldn't afford. I took him to a clinic in downtown Portland, prepared to put him to sleep rather than watch him suffer. But the veterinarian there, an older man named Dr. Walsh, took one look at me and said, 'This dog isn't ready to die, and neither are you.'" Elena turned back to Marcus. "He performed the surgery for free, let me pay it off by working in his clinic, cleaning kennels and helping with basic care. Rex lived another 5 years, and working with those animals taught me something about resilience I'd never understood before. Dr. Walsh saved us both." Marcus felt something stir in his chest. Recognition, maybe, or hope. "Dr. Walsh retired 15 years ago," Elena continued. "But before he did, he made me promise to pass along what he'd given me. The mobile unit, this facility, the work we do, it's all about keeping that promise." And when Dr. Chen called me about a homeless veteran who was caring for stray dogs with no resources except his own heart, I knew Dr. Walsh would have wanted me to help. The story resonated with Marcus in ways he hadn't expected. He'd been so focused on his own pride, his own fears, that he'd forgotten about the larger picture. Sometimes accepting help wasn't about charity. It was about joining something bigger than yourself. The other dogs, Marcus said, what happens to them? They stay with you. We'll get them proper medical care, make sure they're healthy and happy. Luna's puppies will need homes eventually, but we can handle that through our adoption network. Duchess, Bear, and the others can stay as long as they're content here. Marcus looked around the facility again, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a rescue operation or a wealthy person's hobby. It was a vision of what animal care could look like when money and resources were directed by genuine compassion rather than profit margins. When do I start? Elena smiled. How about now? We've got a call from a homeless encampment near the river. Apparently there are several dogs there who need medical attention, and their owners have been asking for help. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation instead of dread at the thought of tomorrow. I'll need to check on Ranger first. Of course. Take all the time you need. The dogs come first. Always. As they walked back toward the veterinary hospital, Elena continued talking about the work they'd be doing. The mobile unit served homeless camps, low-income neighborhoods, rural areas where the nearest veterinarian was hours away. They provided free or low-cost care, focusing on preventative medicine and basic treatment that could keep animals healthy and with their families. The goal isn't to take animals away from people who love them, Elena explained. It's to help people keep their animals healthy and happy, regardless of their economic situation. It was exactly the kind of work Marcus had wanted to do, but never imagined he'd have the opportunity for. In the Army, he'd saved lives because he'd had the training and equipment to do so. On the streets, he'd watched animals suffer because he'd lacked both. Now, for the first time since coming home from Afghanistan, he felt like he might be able to make a real difference again. They found Ranger awake and alert in his recovery room, tail wagging weakly when he saw Marcus approach. The dog's breathing was clear, his eyes bright, his wounds healing cleanly. It was a small miracle, made possible by Dr. Chen's skill and Elena's generosity. He's going to make a full recovery, Dr. Chen said as he checked Ranger's vital signs. Another few days of rest. Then he can start moving around more. He'll always have some scars, but nothing that should limit his activities. Marcus knelt beside the examination table, letting Ranger sniff his hand before gently stroking the dog's head. A week ago, this animal had been dying in a muddy lot, abandoned and forgotten. Now he was receiving the best medical care available, surrounded by people who saw his life as valuable and worth saving. Thank you, Marcus said to Elena, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. Thank you, she replied, for caring enough about these animals to bring them here. For being willing to join our team. For reminding me why this work matters. The first call came in an hour later. A woman from a homeless camp near the Willamette River had heard about the mobile veterinary unit and was asking for help. Her dog, a senior chocolate lab named Coffee, had been limping for weeks and wasn't eating well. She couldn't afford a traditional veterinary visit, but was desperate to help her companion of 8 years. Marcus climbed into the passenger seat of the mobile unit while Dr. Chen drove. They loaded supplies for basic examination and treatment, not knowing what they'd find but prepared for anything from minor injuries to serious illness. It felt good to be heading toward a problem he might actually be able to solve. The homeless camp was larger than Marcus had expected, maybe 50 tents and improvised shelters scattered along the riverbank, protected from view by a grove of cottonwood trees. People had created a small community here, with shared cooking areas, informal security patrols, and unspoken rules about respecting each other's space and belongings. They were met by Teresa, a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and clothes that had been carefully maintained despite obvious wear. Coffee stayed close to her side, a beautiful dog whose chocolate coat had faded to gray around his muzzle, and whose warm eyes reflected both intelligence and pain. I heard you folks help animals whose people can't afford regular vets, Teresa said as they parked the mobile unit. That's exactly what we do, Dr. Chen replied. Tell me about Coffee. While Dr. Chen examined the lab, Marcus found himself looking around the camp with new eyes. A month ago, he might have been living in a place like this, part of a community of people who'd fallen through society's cracks for various reasons. Now he was here as someone who might be able to help, someone with resources and skills to offer. Coffee's problem turned out to be arthritis, common in older labs and treatable with medication and some modifications to his activity level. Dr. Chen prescribed pain relief and anti-inflammatory drugs, showing Teresa how to administer them and explaining what signs to watch for that might indicate complications. "How much do I owe you?" Teresa asked when the examination was complete. "Nothing," Dr. Chen said. "This is a free service." Teresa's eyes filled with tears. "Coffee's been with me since before everything fell apart. I was so afraid I'd have to." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood. The choice between medical care for a beloved animal and other basic necessities was one too many people had to make. Word of their presence spread quickly through the camp. Within an hour, they had examined 6 more animals, dogs and cats who belonged to people who loved them but couldn't afford traditional veterinary care. Marcus found himself taking the lead on several examinations, his military medical training adapting easily to veterinary work under Dr. Chen's guidance. There was a young pit bull with an infected wound on his leg, easily treated with antibiotics and proper cleaning. An elderly cat with dental problems that were causing eating difficulties. A nervous border collie mix who needed vaccinations and flea treatment. Each animal had a story, each human had reasons for being where they were, and each situation reminded Marcus of how thin the line was between stability and crisis. As they prepared to leave, Teresa approached Marcus privately. "I know you," she said quietly. "You used to sleep in the lot behind the industrial district, with the German Shepherd and the other dogs." Marcus nodded, unsure how to respond. The morning sun filtered through the trees surrounding Marcus's cabin as he prepared for another day with the mobile veterinary unit. 3 weeks had passed since he'd started working for Elena Harrison, and the routine had become something he looked forward to rather than endured. He woke each morning to the sound of birds and the distant barking of dogs from the kennels, made coffee in his own kitchen, and walked down the hill to check on Ranger and the others before beginning his shift. Ranger had made a remarkable recovery, though he still favored his left side slightly when he walked. The German Shepherd had claimed a spot on the porch of Marcus's cabin, positioning himself where he could see both the forest path and the veterinary facility below. It was a strategic position that reminded Marcus of his own habits, always knowing where the exits were, always maintaining situational awareness. The other dogs had adapted to their new home with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Bear had appointed himself guardian of the entire facility, making slow, deliberate rounds of the property each evening as if conducting a security inspection. Duchess spent her days in the sunshine near the kennels, watching over Luna's puppies with the patience of an experienced grandmother. Luna herself had blossomed in the safety of the facility, her natural playfulness returning as she realized her children were safe and well-fed. Dr. Chen had become more than just a colleague over the past few weeks. He'd become something Marcus hadn't had in months. A friend. They worked well together, Chen handling the complex medical procedures, while Marcus managed the basic care, communication with pet owners, and the emotional support that often proved as important as the medical treatment itself. This particular morning brought them to a rural area east of Portland, where a call had come in about a farm dog who'd been injured in an encounter with a coyote. The property was accessed by a dirt road that wound through second-growth forest, past clear-cuts that spoke of the area's logging history and small farms carved out of the wilderness by families who valued privacy above convenience. The farmhouse was old but well-maintained, surrounded by outbuildings and fenced pastures where a few horses grazed in the morning mist. A woman in her 70s met them at the gate, her weathered hands clasping and unclasping nervously as she led them toward a barn where her injured dog was resting. "Name's Dorothy Kellison," she said as they walked. "This is my husband Earl's place, though he passed 2 years ago. Just me and the animals now, trying to keep things going." The dog, a mixed breed with the intelligence of a border collie and the size of a Labrador, lay on a blanket in one of the horse stalls. His name was Rusty, Dorothy explained, and he'd been Earl's constant companion for 7 years before becoming hers. The coyote attack had happened 3 days earlier, leaving Rusty with puncture wounds on his neck and shoulder and a reluctance to put weight on his front right leg. Marcus knelt beside the dog while Dr. Chen prepared his examination equipment. Rusty was alert and responsive, his tail giving a weak wag when Marcus spoke softly to him. The wounds were clean. Dorothy had done a good job caring for them with hydrogen peroxide and antibiotic ointment. but they needed professional attention to prevent infection and ensure proper healing. "You did everything right," Marcus told Dorothy as Dr. Chen began his examination. "Keeping the wounds clean, restricting his activity, watching for signs of infection. He's lucky to have someone who knows how to care for animals." Dorothy's face showed relief mixed with exhaustion. "Earl always said I worried too much about the critters, but Rusty's all I got left of him. When I heard that dog crying in the night, found him all torn up." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Dr. Chen's examination revealed that while the wounds were serious, there was no major damage to muscles or joints. Rusty would need antibiotics, pain medication, and restricted activity for a few weeks, but he should make a full recovery. The cost of the medications and follow-up care would have been prohibitive for Dorothy on her fixed income, but Elena's mobile unit made it possible for her to keep her beloved companion. As they prepared to leave, Dorothy insisted on showing them around the property. She was clearly lonely, eager for human conversation after days of worrying alone about Rusty's condition. The farm had been in Earl's family for 3 generations, she explained, but with no children to inherit it and property taxes increasing every year, she wasn't sure how much longer she could maintain it. "Earl would roll over in his grave if he knew I was thinking about selling," she said as they walked past a vegetable garden that showed signs of careful tending, despite being too large for one person. "But I'm 74 years old, and this place needs more work than I can manage alone." Marcus found himself thinking about Dorothy and Rusty on the drive back to the facility. The mobile unit could provide medical care for the dog, but it couldn't address the larger problem of an elderly woman trying to maintain a property and lifestyle that required more resources than she had. It was a familiar pattern: people who loved their animals but lacked the support systems necessary to care for them properly in difficult circumstances. "Cases like Dorothy's are why Elena started this program," Dr. Chen said as if reading Marcus's thoughts. "It's not just about treating sick animals. It's about keeping families together, keeping people connected to the animals they love even when life gets complicated." That afternoon, Marcus found himself in Elena's office discussing the mobile unit's expanding caseload. They were receiving more calls than they could handle, requests for service from communities throughout Oregon and southern Washington. The success of the program was creating its own challenges: how to meet growing demand while maintaining the quality of care that made the service valuable. "We need more mobile units," Elena said, studying a map marked with pins showing their service calls over the past month. "And more staff to operate them. The problem is finding people with the right combination of medical skills, communication abilities, and genuine care for both animals and people." Marcus looked at the map, noting the clusters of pins in areas he recognized as economically disadvantaged communities. "What about training programs? Take people from the communities we serve. Teach them basic veterinary skills. Let them provide care in their own neighborhoods." Elena looked up from the map, interested. "Explain that." "There are people in every community who already care for animals informally, feeding stray cats, helping neighbors with sick dogs, taking in injured wildlife. They just don't have the formal training or resources to do it effectively." Marcus pointed to several clusters of pins. "Instead of driving mobile units to these areas, what if we established permanent locations staffed by local people we've trained?" The idea had been forming in Marcus's mind during their recent service calls. He'd met dozens of people who were already functioning as informal animal care providers in their communities. People who had the instincts and dedication but lacked the knowledge and supplies to be truly effective. Elena spent the next hour questioning Marcus about the details of his proposal, exploring the logistics and potential challenges of such a program. By the end of their conversation, she was convinced enough to authorize a pilot project. They would identify one community where such a program might work and begin developing a training curriculum for local volunteers. That evening, Marcus sat on his cabin porch with Ranger beside him, watching the sun set behind the forest. The German Shepherd had regained most of his strength and energy, though he still preferred to stay close to Marcus rather than exploring the extensive grounds of the facility. It was a preference Marcus understood. After months of uncertainty and danger, the comfort of familiar companionship outweighed the appeal of adventure. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chen. Emergency call came in. Family with 3 dogs stranded by flooding near Estacada. "Can you meet me at the facility in 20 minutes? Marcus looked down at Ranger, who was already standing and moving toward the cabin door, as if he understood that duty was calling. "Want to come along, boy? Time to get back to work." The drive to Estacada took them through mountainous terrain, where recent heavy rains had swollen creeks and rivers beyond their banks. They passed several roads marked with flooding and road closed signs, evidence of the weather system that had been dumping rain on the Pacific Northwest for the past week. The mobile unit's four-wheel drive and high clearance made it possible to navigate routes that would have been impassable for ordinary vehicles. The family they were responding to lived in a small house on what had been a quiet side road before the creek behind their property overflowed its banks. Now their home was accessible only by a narrow strip of high ground that was rapidly disappearing under rising water. Tom and Sarah Mitchell had been trapped there for 4 days with their 3 dogs, a senior golden retriever named Honey, a young Australian shepherd mix called Scout, and a nervous chihuahua named Peanut who'd been rescued from a puppy mill. "We can get ourselves out," Tom explained as he helped them unload equipment from the mobile unit. "Been packing up what we can carry and planning to walk out to the main road, but we can't carry Honey. She's got hip problems and can't walk that far, and we're not leaving without her." Honey was indeed suffering from advanced arthritis that made extended walking painful and difficult. Scout was young and energetic enough to handle an evacuation hike, and Peanut was small enough to be carried, but getting Honey to safety would require either a stretcher or some form of vehicular transport. Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 50s with the calloused hands of someone who worked outdoors, knelt beside Honey while Dr. Chen examined the old dog. "She's been with us for 11 years. She was Earl's dog before she was ours. He gave her to us when he got too sick to care for her properly." Marcus looked up sharply. "Earl? Earl Kellison? You knew Earl?" Tom asked in surprise. "We just treated his widow's dog yesterday." "Dorothy. Rusty got tangled up with a coyote." The coincidence seemed impossible, but as they talked, the connections became clear. Earl Kellison had been well known in the rural communities east of Portland, a man who'd helped his neighbors with everything from equipment repairs to animal care throughout his lifetime. Dorothy had inherited not just his farm, but his reputation as someone who could be counted on in difficult situations. "Earl would have been here himself if he was still alive," Sarah said. "Probably would have waded through that flood to help us get Honey to safety." The immediate problem remained unsolved, however. The water was still rising, and they needed to evacuate both the family and their animals before the narrow strip of high ground disappeared entirely. Dr. Chen examined Honey carefully, determining that while her arthritis was painful, she was otherwise healthy enough to handle the stress of an evacuation if they could minimize the physical demands on her joints. Marcus studied the terrain, his military training automatically assessing options and obstacles. The main road was about half a mile away through forest that was partially flooded, but still passable on foot. They could carry Peanut, Scout could walk, but Honey would need to be transported somehow. "What about a travois?" Marcus suggested. "We can make a stretcher using poles and a tarp, drag her over the ground instead of trying to carry her." It was a technique he'd learned in wilderness survival training, adapted from Native American methods of transporting heavy loads over difficult terrain. Using supplies from the mobile unit and materials from the Mitchell property, they constructed a simple but effective stretcher that could be pulled behind one person while another steadied the load. The evacuation took 2 hours of careful movement through flooded forest, with Marcus and Tom taking turns pulling the travois while Sarah and Dr. Chen managed the other dogs and navigated around fallen trees and washed-out sections of trail. Honey seemed to understand that something important was happening, remaining calm and still despite the strange experience of being dragged through the woods on a makeshift stretcher. When they finally reached the main road, where other members of the Mitchell family were waiting with vehicles, Sarah broke down in tears of relief and gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said to Marcus and Dr. Chen. "We couldn't have done this without your help." But Marcus was already thinking beyond the immediate rescue. The Mitchells would need temporary housing for themselves and their dogs, while their property dried out and flood damage was repaired. Honey would need ongoing care for her arthritis, and the stress of displacement might exacerbate health problems in all 3 animals. "We'll check on them in a few days," he told Dr. Chen as they drove back toward the facility. "Make sure the kind habilitator dogs are handling the transition, okay? See if there are any medical issues that develop from the stress." It was nearly midnight when they returned to Elena's facility, both men exhausted but satisfied with the night's work. They'd successfully evacuated a family and their beloved pets from a dangerous situation, using skills and resources that wouldn't have been available through traditional veterinary services. Elena was waiting for them in the veterinary hospital, having stayed late to monitor some of the animals in their care. When they described the evening's rescue operation, she listened with the intense focus that Marcus had learned to associate with her planning mind at work. "This is exactly why the mobile unit program matters," she said when they finished their account. "It's not just about providing medical care. It's about being there when people need help the most, when traditional services can't or won't respond." Over the following days, Marcus found himself thinking more about the connections between the people they served and the communities they came from. Earl Kellison's influence had extended far beyond his own farm, creating a network of mutual support that continued to function even after his death. Dorothy was struggling to maintain his legacy alone, while people like the Mitchells were dealing with their own challenges in isolation. The idea that had been forming during his conversation with Elena about training programs began to crystallize into something more concrete. What if they could recreate Earl Kellison's model of community support on a larger scale? Instead of depending on individual Good Samaritans like Earl, what if they could establish formal networks of trained animal care providers who could respond to both routine needs and emergency situations? Marcus presented his refined proposal to Elena during their weekly planning meeting. The pilot program would focus on the rural communities east of Portland, where people like Dorothy Kellison and the Mitchells were dealing with animal care challenges that exceeded their individual resources. They would identify natural leaders in each community, people who were already providing informal animal care, and provide them with training, supplies, and ongoing support. "It's ambitious," Elena said, studying the detailed plan Marcus had prepared. Training programs, supply distribution, communication networks, emergency response protocols. "We're talking about building an entire infrastructure. But an infrastructure that's based on what already exists," Marcus pointed out. "We're not trying to impose something foreign on these communities. We're trying to support what they're already doing and make it more effective." Elena was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the proposal and considering its implications. Finally, she looked up with the expression Marcus had learned to recognize as her decision-making face. "Do it," she said. "Start with a small pilot program, maybe 5 communities. If it works, we'll expand it. If it doesn't work, we'll learn from the failure and try something else." The next month was spent identifying potential participants for the pilot program and developing training materials that would be appropriate for people with varying levels of education and experience. Marcus found himself drawing on his military background in ways he hadn't expected. Not just medical training, but leadership principles, logistics planning, and the kind of practical problem-solving that enabled small units to operate independently in challenging environments. Dorothy Kellison was their first recruit, a decision that surprised no one who knew her story. Despite her age and the challenges she faced maintaining Earl's farm, she had decades of experience caring for animals and a network of relationships throughout the rural community that made her an ideal coordinator for local efforts. "Earl always said I should have been a veterinarian instead of a farmer's wife," she told Marcus when he visited to discuss the program. "Maybe this is my chance to prove him right." The training program combined formal instruction at Elena's facility with hands-on practice in the communities where participants would be working. Marcus and Dr. Chen developed a curriculum that covered basic animal health assessment, wound care, medication administration, and emergency stabilization techniques. But just as importantly, they focused on communication skills, resource management, and the kind of community organizing that would be necessary to make the program sustainable. The first group of trainees included Dorothy, 2 other rural residents with animal care experience, a retired veterinary technician who'd moved to the area for affordable housing, and a young woman named Maria Santos, whose family had been providing informal animal care services to the local Latino community for years. Maria proved to be one of the most dedicated students in the program, approaching each lesson with an intensity that reminded Marcus of his own determination to master new skills during his military training. She was bilingual, which would be crucial for serving Spanish-speaking families in the area, and she had an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that impressed even Dr. Chen. "My grandmother always said animals choose their people, not the other way around," Maria explained during one of their training sessions. "My job is just to help people understand what their animals are trying to tell them." As the training program progressed, Marcus found himself spending more time in the field with the participants, helping them apply their new skills in real-world situations. It was during one of these field exercises that he encountered a situation that would test everything he'd learned about both veterinary care and community organizing. The call came from Maria, who'd been contacted by a family whose dog had been hit by a car on a rural highway. The family spoke limited English and had no transportation to reach a traditional veterinary clinic, but they'd heard about the new community animal care program and hoped someone could help. Marcus arrived at the scene to find a chaotic situation. The dog, a young pit bull mix named Diego, had been struck by a vehicle and was suffering from what appeared to be internal injuries and possible broken bones. The family, parents, grandparents, and 3 young children, were gathered around the injured animal, speaking rapidly in Spanish and clearly frightened by both Diego's condition and the prospect of dealing with authorities or institutions they didn't trust. Maria was already there, kneeling beside Diego and speaking softly to the family in Spanish while she conducted the kind of preliminary assessment Marcus had taught her. Her presence had clearly calmed the situation, providing a bridge between the family's needs and the medical care Diego required. "He needs surgery," she told Marcus quietly in English. "Internal bleeding, I think. Maybe broken ribs." Marcus confirmed her assessment, recognizing injuries that were beyond the scope of field treatment. Diego would need to be transported to Elena's facility immediately, but the family was resistant to the idea of letting their dog be taken away by strangers. The grandfather, a man in his 70s who seemed to be the family's decision-maker, spoke to Maria in rapid Spanish. She listened carefully, then turned to Marcus with concern in her eyes. "He's worried about the cost, but it's more than that," she explained. "They've had bad experiences with authorities before. Immigration issues. They're afraid if they take Diego to a clinic, someone will ask questions about their status." Marcus understood the dilemma immediately. The family's fear of drawing official attention was preventing them from getting help for their injured dog, and Diego's condition was deteriorating while they debated options. It was exactly the kind of situation the community program was designed to address, a medical emergency complicated by social and economic barriers that traditional veterinary services couldn't navigate. "Tell him I'm a veteran, not an immigration officer," Marcus said to Maria. "Tell him I've been where they are, worried about surviving one day at a time. All I care about is saving their dog." Maria translated, and Marcus watched the grandfather's expression soften slightly. But it wasn't until Marcus knelt beside Diego and began speaking directly to the injured animal, using the same calm, reassuring tone he'd used with wounded soldiers in Afghanistan, that the family seemed to understand his intentions. "We take Diego to the animal hospital," Marcus said through Maria. "Family comes too. Stay with him during treatment. No questions about papers, no reports to anyone. Just medical care for a dog who needs help." The grandfather nodded slowly, but he insisted that the entire family accompany Diego to Elena's facility. What should have been a 20-minute emergency transport turned into a convoy of 3 vehicles, carrying not just the injured dog, but 8 family members who refused to be separated from him during his crisis. Elena met them at the veterinary hospital, taking in the situation with a glance that encompassed the injured pit bull, the frightened family, and the obvious cultural and language barriers that were complicating what should have been a straightforward medical emergency. "Maria, you'll translate for the family during surgery prep," she said calmly. "Marcus, you'll assist Dr. Chen in the operating room. Everyone else, there's a family waiting area, with coffee and sandwiches. This is going to take a while." Diego's surgery lasted 4 hours, during which the extended family maintained a vigil in the waiting area, while Maria provided updates in Spanish and Elena ensured they had food and comfortable places to rest. The youngest children, initially frightened by the unfamiliar environment, gradually relaxed as they realized the adults around them were focused entirely on helping their beloved pet. When Dr. Chen finally emerged from surgery with news that Diego would recover fully, the family's relief was palpable. But what happened next surprised even Marcus, who thought he'd seen every possible reaction to the mobile unit services. The grandfather approached Elena directly, speaking in heavily accented but clear English that he'd apparently been saving for this moment. "How much we owe?" he asked simply. Elena looked at the family, working people who clearly had limited resources but unlimited love for their dog, and made the same decision she'd made hundreds of times before. "Diego's surgery is covered by our emergency fund," she said. "What you owe us is to take good care of him while he recovers and to tell other families about our services if they need help with their animals." The grandfather nodded solemnly, but before leaving he pressed a folded piece of paper into Maria's hand. When she opened it later, she found $50 and a note in Spanish that translated roughly to, "For the next family who needs help but has nothing to give." The Diego incident became a turning point for the community animal care program. Word spread quickly through the Latino community about the veterinary services that asked no questions about immigration status and judged families only by their love for their animals. Within weeks, Maria was fielding calls from Spanish-speaking families throughout the region, many of whom had been caring for sick or injured animals without professional help, because they feared the consequences of seeking formal veterinary care. But the program's success also created unexpected challenges. As more families learned about the services available through Elena's facility, demand began to exceed the capacity of both the mobile unit and the community volunteers. Emergency cases like Diego required immediate transport to the full-service veterinary hospital, but routine care, vaccinations, basic health checks, minor wound treatment, could potentially be handled in the field if the volunteers had adequate training and supplies. Marcus found himself working longer hours, splitting time between the mobile unit's regular route and training sessions for new community volunteers. The pilot program had expanded from 5 communities to 12, with more requests coming in every week from rural areas that lacked access to affordable veterinary care. It was during one of these marathon training sessions that Marcus first noticed the symptoms he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. Fatigue that went beyond normal tiredness, difficulty concentrating during complex procedures, occasional tremors in his hands that reminded him uncomfortably of his early days after returning from Afghanistan. He told himself it was just overwork, the natural consequence of taking on too many responsibilities too quickly. The transition from homeless veteran to community leader had happened faster than he'd expected, and perhaps he was simply pushing himself too hard in his eagerness to prove worthy of the opportunities Elena had provided. But the symptoms persisted and gradually worsened, culminating in an incident that forced him to confront what he'd been trying to deny. He was conducting a routine examination of a farm dog when his hands began shaking uncontrollably. The tremors were mild at first, barely noticeable as he checked the animal's heartbeat and respiratory rate. But as he attempted to draw blood for testing, his coordination deteriorated to the point where Dr. Chen had to take over the procedure. "Marcus, we need to talk," Dr. Chen said after they'd finished treating the dog and were preparing to leave the farm. They drove in silence to a quiet spot overlooking the valley where Elena's facility was located. The mobile unit parked beneath towering Douglas fir trees while they addressed what could no longer be ignored. "How long have you been having tremors?" Dr. Chen asked directly. Marcus considered lying, minimizing the problem, or deflecting with humor. But Dr. Chen had become too good a friend for deception, and the community program was too important to risk through his own denial. "Few weeks," Marcus admitted. "Maybe longer. Hard to tell the difference between normal stress and something more serious." "Any other symptoms? Sleep problems? Anxiety? Difficulty concentrating?" "All of the above. But I figured it was just adjustment stress, you know? Going from sleeping rough to having real responsibility again." Dr. Chen was quiet for several minutes, looking out over the valley while he considered his response. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful tone of a medical professional delivering difficult news. "Marcus, I think you're dealing with delayed onset PTSD symptoms. The stress of your new responsibilities, combined with the emotional intensity of the work we're doing, may have triggered a psychological response that you've been managing to suppress until now." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd been proud of his ability to function normally since starting work at Elena's facility, proud of putting his military training to constructive use, proud of building something meaningful with the community program. The possibility that his own psychological problems might threaten all of that progress was more frightening than any physical injury. "What does that mean for the program?" he asked. "For my job here?" "It means you need treatment. Professional help, possibly medication. Definitely time to address what you've been dealing with since coming home from Afghanistan." Dr. Chen turned to look at him directly. "But it doesn't mean the end of anything, Marcus. It means getting the support you need to keep doing the work that matters to you." The conversation continued for another hour, covering treatment options, the likelihood of full recovery, and the immediate modifications to Marcus's responsibilities that would be necessary while he addressed his psychological health. Dr. Chen emphasized that PTSD was a medical condition, not a character flaw, and that seeking treatment demonstrated strength rather than weakness. But Marcus couldn't shake the fear that he was once again becoming a burden rather than an asset, someone who needed help rather than someone who could provide it. The community program was thriving, with new volunteers joining every week and families throughout the region depending on their services. The last thing these communities needed was an unreliable coordinator whose own problems might compromise their access to animal care. That evening, Marcus sat on his cabin porch with Ranger beside him, watching the sun set behind the forest while he wrestled with decisions he didn't want to make. The German Shepherd seemed to sense his distress, pressing closer against Marcus's leg and occasionally looking up with concerned brown eyes. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Family called about sick goat. Can you meet me tomorrow morning at the Rodriguez farm?" Marcus stared at the message, knowing he should respond immediately with details about time and location. But his hands were shaking again, making it difficult to type accurately, and the simple task of coordinating a routine farm visit suddenly seemed overwhelming. He closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe slowly, using techniques he'd learned in therapy years earlier but hadn't practiced in months. The tremors gradually subsided, and he was able to respond to Maria's text with the professional competence she expected from him. But as he prepared for bed that night, Marcus couldn't escape the growing certainty that his problems were becoming too serious to ignore and too dangerous to conceal. The community program deserved a leader who could function reliably under stress, and the animals they served deserved care providers whose own struggles wouldn't compromise their medical judgment. The question that kept him awake was whether he had the courage to seek help before his condition deteriorated further, or whether pride and fear would once again drive him away from the stability and purpose he'd finally managed to build. The next morning brought a crisis that would test not only Marcus's ability to function under pressure, but also the strength of the community network they'd been working to establish. Maria's text had mentioned a sick goat at the Rodriguez farm, but when Marcus arrived at the property, he found a situation that was far more complex than a simple livestock health check. The Rodriguez family operated a small dairy goat operation that supplied milk and cheese to several local restaurants and farmers markets. Their herd of 12 goats represented not just beloved animals, but the foundation of their economic survival. 3 of the goats were showing symptoms of what appeared to be a serious respiratory infection: lethargy, difficulty breathing, nasal discharge, and elevated temperatures. But more concerning was the rapid spread of symptoms from one animal to others, suggesting a contagious condition that could potentially destroy the entire herd if not contained quickly. Maria was already examining one of the sick goats when Marcus arrived, her careful attention to detail and gentle handling technique demonstrating how much she'd learned during the training program. But her expression showed the same concern Marcus felt as he surveyed the situation. "Started 3 days ago with Esperanza," she explained, indicating a brown and white doe who was clearly the most severely affected. "Now Dulce and Corazon are showing the same symptoms, and I think Pequeña might be starting to get sick too." Marcus examined each of the affected animals, his military medical training adapting to the unique challenges of goat physiology and behavior. The respiratory symptoms were consistent with several possible conditions, ranging from relatively minor bacterial infections that could be treated with antibiotics to more serious viral diseases that could spread rapidly through the herd and potentially to other farms in the area. But as he worked, Marcus became increasingly aware that his hands were trembling again, making fine motor tasks, like taking temperatures and drawing blood samples, more difficult than they should have been. He managed to complete the examinations without Maria noticing his problems, but the effort required to maintain steady hands and clear thinking was exhausting. "We need to get samples to a lab for testing," he told Maria after examining all 4 potentially infected goats. "And we need to isolate the sick animals from the healthy ones immediately to prevent further spread." The Rodriguez family watched anxiously as Marcus and Maria worked to set up a temporary isolation area using portable fencing and tarps. Roberto Rodriguez, the farm's owner, spoke limited English, but his concern for his animals was evident in every gesture and expression. His wife Carmen and their teenage daughter Sofia helped move the healthy goats to a separate pasture, while maintaining the careful hygiene protocols Marcus had explained through Maria's translation. But the real challenge came when Marcus tried to contact the veterinary laboratory for emergency testing services. His hands were shaking badly enough that dialing the phone was difficult, And when he finally reached the lab coordinator, he found himself struggling to articulate the urgency of the situation clearly. "Sir, are you all right?" the lab coordinator asked after Marcus had to repeat his request for the third time. "You sound like you might be having some kind of medical emergency." Marcus ended the call abruptly, embarrassed by his inability to function normally and frightened by how quickly his condition was deteriorating. Maria was watching him with growing concern, clearly aware that something was wrong despite his efforts to conceal his problems. "Marcus, maybe you should sit down," she said gently. "Let me handle the lab coordination. You've taught me how to communicate with veterinary professionals." It was exactly the kind of situation the community program was designed for. Local volunteers, taking initiative to solve problems using skills and knowledge they'd developed through training and experience. But Marcus found himself resenting rather than celebrating Maria's competence, seeing it as evidence of his own inadequacy rather than proof of the program's success. While Maria coordinated with the laboratory and arranged for sample pickup, Marcus sat in the shade of an oak tree, trying to control his tremors and racing thoughts. The Rodriguez family's livelihood depended on quick, accurate diagnosis and treatment of their goats' illness. The broader community's trust in the animal care program depended on their ability to handle emergencies professionally and effectively. And Marcus's own sense of worth depended on proving that he could be relied upon when people needed help most. But his body was betraying him in the same way it had betrayed him during those dark months after returning from Afghanistan, when nightmares and anxiety had made it impossible to hold a job or maintain relationships. The irony was bitter. Just when he'd finally found work that gave his life meaning and purpose, his psychological problems were threatening to destroy everything he'd built. Maria returned from her phone calls with news that the lab could process their samples within 24 hours if they could deliver them that afternoon. She'd also contacted Dr. Chen, who was arranging for antibiotic treatment to begin immediately while they waited for test results to confirm the specific pathogen involved. "The Rodriguez family wants to know if they should cancel their deliveries to restaurants this week," Maria said. "They're worried about contaminating other farms or making people sick with infected milk." It was a reasonable precaution that demonstrated the family's responsibility and concern for their community, but it also meant several days of lost income for a family that operated on narrow financial margins. Income they could ill afford to lose during what might be an extended treatment period for their herd. Marcus tried to focus on the immediate medical decisions required by the situation, but his concentration kept fragmenting. Simple calculations about medication dosages and treatment schedules became complicated puzzles that required multiple attempts to solve correctly. At one point, he caught himself recommending a drug combination that could have been harmful to goats, an error that Maria politely questioned before he realized his mistake. "Maybe Dr. Chen should come out here himself," Maria suggested tactfully. "This seems like a complex case that might need a veterinarian's direct attention." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he was capable of handling the situation despite his obvious struggles. But the Rodriguez family's animals deserved better than a coordinator whose judgment was compromised by psychological problems he was no longer able to ignore. "You're right," he said quietly. "Call Dr. Chen. Tell him we need him here as soon as possible." Dr. Chen arrived within an hour, bringing supplies and expertise that quickly stabilized the situation. His examination of the affected goats confirmed Marcus's initial assessment and treatment recommendations, but his presence allowed for more sophisticated diagnostic procedures and treatment options than the community volunteers could provide alone. While Dr. Chen worked with the sick animals, Marcus found himself relegated to a supporting role, helping with equipment, translating instructions through Maria, documenting treatment details for the Rodriguez family's records. It was useful work that contributed to the goats' care, but it was also a clear demonstration that his leadership role in the community program was being quietly reassigned to more capable hands. The laboratory results confirmed that the goats were suffering from a bacterial respiratory infection that would respond well to antibiotic treatment. With proper care and isolation procedures, the affected animals should recover fully within 2 weeks, and the risk of transmission to other farms was minimal as long as basic hygiene protocols were followed. But as they prepared to leave the Rodriguez farm, Dr. Chen asked Marcus to ride with him back to the facility instead of driving separately, a request that Marcus understood was motivated by concern rather than convenience. The 20-minute drive through rolling hills and forest roads provided an opportunity for the kind of difficult conversation that Marcus had been dreading but knew was inevitable. "The tremors are getting worse," Dr. Chen said without preamble once they were alone in the vehicle. "And I noticed some confusion during the medication calculations today. That's not something we can ignore anymore." Marcus stared out the passenger window at farmland that looked peaceful and orderly compared to the chaos in his own mind. "How bad did I mess up today?" "You didn't mess up. Maria caught the medication error before any harm was done, and your initial assessment of the goats was completely accurate. But Marcus, you're struggling in ways that are becoming visible to other people. That's not fair to you, and it's not safe for the animals we're treating." The directness of Dr. Chen's words was both painful and relieving. Marcus had been expending enormous energy trying to conceal his deteriorating condition, energy that could have been better used addressing the underlying problems. But acknowledging the severity of his symptoms felt like admitting defeat, like accepting that he was once again becoming the broken veteran who needed rescue, rather than the competent professional who could provide assistance. "What happens to the community program if I can't function as coordinator?" Marcus asked. "The community program continues because it's bigger than any one person now. Maria is ready to take on more responsibility. Dorothy Kellison has been training 2 new volunteers in her area, and we've got requests from communities in 3 different counties to establish similar programs." Dr. Chen glanced at Marcus before returning his attention to the road. "You built something sustainable, Marcus. It doesn't depend on you being superhuman to keep working." They drove in silence for several minutes while Marcus processed this information. The program's success had been his greatest source of pride and purpose since starting work at Elena's facility. But he'd also begun to see it as entirely dependent on his personal involvement. The idea that it might continue and even expand without his direct participation was simultaneously comforting and unsettling. "I need to talk to Elena," Marcus said finally. "Tell her what's going on before she hears about it from someone else." "She already knows." Marcus turned to look at Dr. Chen in surprise. "What do you mean she already knows?" "Elena Harrison didn't build a multi-million-dollar business by being oblivious to what's happening with her employees. She's noticed the changes in your behavior over the past few weeks, just like I have. The difference is that she's been waiting for you to feel safe enough to ask for help instead of forcing the conversation." The revelation that Elena had been aware of his struggles while allowing him to maintain the illusion of concealing them effectively was both embarrassing and touching. It suggested a level of understanding and patience that Marcus hadn't expected from someone in her position, but it also raised questions about what she planned to do with her knowledge. When they arrived at the facility, Elena was waiting for them in her office, which had been prepared for what was clearly going to be a serious discussion. There were 3 chairs arranged in a conversational triangle, a pot of coffee, and the kind of privacy that came from closing doors and clearing schedules. "How are you feeling, Marcus?" Elena asked once they were all seated. The question was simple, but Marcus understood it was an invitation to honesty rather than a polite greeting. He looked at Elena and Dr. Chen, 2 people who had given him opportunities and support when he'd had nothing to offer in return, and decided that they deserved the truth, even if it was difficult to speak. "I'm struggling," he said quietly. "The tremors, the concentration problems, the anxiety. It's getting worse, and I'm starting to make mistakes that could affect the animals we're treating." Elena nodded as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "How can we help?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd been prepared for disappointment, perhaps termination, certainly some form of professional consequences for his inability to maintain the standards his position required. But Elena's immediate focus on support rather than judgment suggested a different approach to handling employee health problems. "I probably need professional help," Marcus admitted. "Therapy, maybe medication. Time to get my head straight before I hurt someone or damage the program." "That can be arranged," Elena said matter-of-factly. "Our employee health insurance includes comprehensive mental health coverage, and I know several excellent therapists who specialize in veteran issues. The question is what kind of schedule you need for treatment and how we can modify your responsibilities while you're getting help." Dr. Chen leaned forward in his chair. "The community program is at a point where it can function with less direct coordination from Marcus. Maria is ready to handle day-to-day operations, and the volunteer network has developed enough experience to manage routine situations independently." Marcus felt a complex mixture of relief and loss as they discussed the practical arrangements for his reduced involvement in the program. Relief, because the pressure to maintain perfect competence despite his psychological problems would be lifted. Loss, because stepping back from active leadership meant acknowledging that his condition was serious enough to require major life changes. "There's something else we need to discuss," Elena said after they'd covered the immediate adjustments to Marcus's work schedule. "The community program has been so successful that we've received a major grant offer from a national foundation that wants to fund expansion into 5 additional states." Marcus looked up sharply, surprised by this development. "A grant for what kind of expansion?" "Training materials, mobile veterinary units, coordinator positions, community volunteer networks. Everything you've developed here, scaled up to serve rural areas throughout the Pacific Northwest and Northern California." Elena's expression showed the kind of excitement she typically reserved for discussing her most ambitious projects. "They want you to head the expansion effort." The irony was almost overwhelming. At the exact moment when his psychological problems were forcing him to step back from his current responsibilities, he was being offered the opportunity to lead a massive expansion of the program that had become his life's work. It felt like being offered a promotion on the same day he was being fired, a chance to achieve everything he'd dreamed of just when he was least capable of taking advantage of it. "I can't take that on right now," Marcus said, his voice carrying more regret than he'd intended. "I can barely manage my current responsibilities." "The grant doesn't start for 6 months," Elena said gently. "That's time to get treatment. Time to stabilize your condition. Time to prepare for a new kind of challenge that might be exactly what you need to move forward." Dr. Chen nodded in agreement. Leading a regional expansion program would be different from coordinating local services. More strategic planning, less hands-on fieldwork. It might actually be easier to manage while you're dealing with PTSD symptoms. Marcus wanted to dismiss the possibility immediately, to focus on his current problems rather than entertaining fantasies about future opportunities. But Elena and Dr. Chen were both looking at him with expressions that suggested they saw potential he couldn't recognize in himself, possibilities for recovery and growth that extended beyond merely managing his symptoms. "Let me get through the next few months first," Marcus said finally. "See how the treatment goes, how well I respond to professional help. Then we can talk about whether I'm ready for that kind of responsibility." Elena smiled, the expression transforming her businesslike demeanor into something warmer and more personal. "Fair enough. But Marcus, I want you to understand something important. This offer isn't charity or sympathy. It's based on what you've accomplished here, what you've proven you can do even while dealing with serious personal challenges. Your PTSD doesn't disqualify you from leadership. It just means you need the right kind of support to do your best work." The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about Marcus's modified work schedule, treatment options, and the gradual transition of his responsibilities to other team members. But the most important part had already been accomplished, the acknowledgement that his psychological problems were medical issues rather than character flaws, and that seeking treatment represented strength rather than weakness. That evening, Marcus sat on his cabin porch with Ranger beside him, watching the sun set behind the forest while he contemplated the changes that lay ahead. The German Shepherd seemed to sense the significance of the moment, pressing closer against Marcus's leg and occasionally looking up with the kind of patient attention that had made him such a valuable companion during the darkest periods of Marcus's recovery. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Rodriguez's family says goats are already looking better. Esperanza was eating hay this afternoon. Thank you for everything today." Marcus typed back a response expressing gratitude for her competent handling of the laboratory coordination and her willingness to take on expanded responsibilities as his own role shifted. But as he prepared to send the message, his hands began trembling again, making it difficult to type accurately. Instead of fighting the tremors or becoming frustrated by his limitations, Marcus took a deep breath and accepted the moment for what it was, evidence that he needed help, but also evidence that he was surrounded by people capable of providing it. He managed to send a simplified version of his message, then put the phone aside and focused on the peaceful evening scene before him. The next morning brought a call that would test the community program's ability to function with reduced input from Marcus, while simultaneously providing an opportunity for him to contribute in ways that didn't require perfect physical coordination or unwavering concentration. Maria had been contacted by a social worker in Portland who was dealing with a complex situation involving an elderly homeless man and his disabled dog. The man, whose name was Frank Morrison, had been living on the streets for nearly 2 years with a 3-legged pit bull named Lucky. Both were in poor health, but Frank was refusing social services assistance because he wouldn't accept help that didn't include provisions for his dog. The social worker says there are housing programs that could help Frank, but none of them allow pets, Maria explained during her phone call with Marcus. And Frank won't consider giving up Lucky, even temporarily. They've been together for 4 years, ever since Lucky lost his leg in a car accident that Frank couldn't afford to treat properly. Marcus understood the situation immediately, recognizing both Frank's loyalty to his companion and the bureaucratic inflexibility that made it impossible for traditional social services to address human and animal needs simultaneously. It was exactly the kind of complex problem that required the integrated approach the community program had developed, treating human and animal welfare as interconnected rather than separate issues. "What kind of help does Lucky need medically?" Marcus asked. "Pain management for his missing leg, probably dental work, definitely better nutrition." The social worker thinks Frank's been giving Lucky most of his food, trying to keep the dog healthy while his own condition deteriorates. The parallel between Frank and Lucky's situation and Marcus's own experience with Ranger was impossible to ignore. Both involved veterans who'd prioritized their animal companions' welfare over their own survival, demonstrating the kind of loyalty that created bonds stronger than most human relationships. But unlike Marcus, Frank hadn't encountered anyone willing to help both him and his dog simultaneously. "I'll meet you at the encampment," Marcus told Maria. "This sounds like something we should handle together." The homeless camp where Frank and Lucky were staying was located beneath an overpass in southeast Portland, a temporary community of tents and improvised shelters that provided basic protection from weather while remaining vulnerable to periodic displacement by city authorities. Marcus had lived in similar places during his own time on the streets, and returning to one brought back memories he usually tried to suppress. They found Frank sitting outside a small tent, Lucky lying beside him in the shade of a shopping cart loaded with their combined possessions. The man was probably in his 60s, though malnutrition and exposure had aged him beyond his years. His clothes were clean but worn, and his interaction with Lucky showed the gentle care of someone who'd made his animal companion's welfare a priority, despite his own desperate circumstances. Lucky was a beautiful dog despite his missing front leg and the obvious signs of inadequate veterinary care. His coat was dull and thin, his remaining teeth showed evidence of serious decay, and his eyes held the kind of pain that came from chronic discomfort. But his tail wagged when Marcus and Maria approached, and his attachment to Frank was evident in every gesture and movement. "You the folks Maria said might be able to help Lucky?" Frank asked without preamble. His voice was hoarse but intelligent, carrying the educated accent of someone who'd had a different life before circumstances brought him to the streets. "That's us," Marcus replied, settling cross-legged on the ground so he could examine Lucky without forcing the dog to stand. "What's Lucky's story?" Frank's account of Lucky's history took nearly an hour, covering their life together before homelessness, the car accident that had cost Lucky his leg, and their subsequent struggles to survive on Portland's streets. Frank had been a machinist before plant closures and health problems destroyed his stable life, while Lucky had been a family pet whose owners abandoned him after his expensive injury made him an inconvenient responsibility. "Found him at the animal shelter, scheduled to be put down because nobody wanted a 3-legged pit bull," Frank explained, his hand resting protectively on Lucky's head. "Figured we were both broken enough to understand each other." Marcus's examination of Lucky revealed problems that were serious, but treatable with proper care and resources. The dog's missing leg had healed adequately, though he would benefit from pain management and physical therapy to improve his mobility. His dental issues required professional attention, and his nutritional deficiencies needed immediate correction, but nothing about his condition was hopeless or beyond repair. "Lucky's going to be fine with proper treatment," Marcus told Frank. "The question is whether you're willing to accept help that includes both of you." Frank's expression showed the wariness that Marcus remembered from his own interactions with well-meaning social service providers. "What kind of help?" "Housing that allows pets, medical care for both you and Lucky, assistance with food and basic necessities until you can get back on your feet." Marcus kept his voice calm and matter-of-fact, avoiding the condescending tone that often characterized offers of assistance to homeless people. No strings attached, except taking care of yourselves and each other. It was an offer that would have sounded impossible to Frank based on his previous experiences with social services. But Elena's network of contacts and resources made it achievable. The pet-friendly housing was provided through a nonprofit that Elena supported financially. The medical care would be handled through the community program's existing partnerships, and the temporary assistance would come from emergency funds that Elena maintained specifically for situations like Frank and Lucky's. But Frank's acceptance required trust that Marcus understood was difficult to give after years of disappointment and institutional failure. Homeless people learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true, because they usually were. "Why would you do all this for me and Lucky?" Frank asked finally. "We're nobody special, just a broken-down man and a crippled dog." Marcus looked at Lucky, whose intelligent eyes were watching the conversation with obvious interest, then at Frank, whose love for his companion was evident despite his own desperate circumstances. "Because somebody did it for me and my dog when we needed help," Marcus said simply. "And because Lucky deserves a chance to be pain-free and well-fed, just like you deserve a chance to get your life back together." The process of transitioning Frank and Lucky from street homelessness to stable housing took 2 weeks and required coordination between multiple agencies and service providers. But by the end of the month, both were settled in a small apartment that welcomed pets. Lucky was receiving regular veterinary care for his chronic conditions, and Frank was working with social services to address his own health and employment needs. More importantly for Marcus, the successful resolution of Frank and Lucky's situation demonstrated that the community program could handle complex cases that required both animal welfare expertise and human social services coordination. It also showed that Marcus could contribute meaningfully to challenging situations, even when his PTSD symptoms prevented him from taking primary responsibility for logistics and implementation. The success with Frank and Lucky coincided with Marcus beginning regular therapy sessions with Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychologist who specialized in veteran mental health issues and had extensive experience treating PTSD. The sessions were initially difficult, requiring Marcus to examine traumatic experiences and emotional responses he'd been avoiding for years, but Dr. Kim's approach focused on practical coping strategies rather than extended exploration of psychological causes. "The goal isn't to eliminate your PTSD symptoms completely," Dr. Kim explained during one of their early sessions. "It's to develop tools that allow you to manage those symptoms effectively while continuing to live a meaningful and productive life." The distinction was important, because it reframed Marcus's condition as something to be managed rather than cured, a chronic issue that could be controlled through proper treatment rather than a fatal flaw that disqualified him from normal functioning. It also meant that his work with the community program could continue in modified form rather than ending entirely. Over the next 3 months, Marcus's role gradually evolved from day-to-day program coordinator to strategic consultant and mentor for new volunteers. He spent less time in the field providing direct animal care and more time developing training materials, establishing partnerships with other organizations, and planning the expansion program that would eventually spread their model to other regions. The work suited his current capabilities while allowing him to contribute his experience and expertise in ways that weren't compromised by tremors or concentration problems. He could review training curricula for accuracy and completeness even when his hands were shaking, and he could mentor new volunteers through video calls that didn't require perfect physical coordination. Most importantly, the modified role allowed him to maintain connection with the program that had given his life meaning and purpose while accepting the reality of his psychological limitations. It was a compromise that honored both his need for meaningful work and his need for appropriate medical treatment. The breakthrough moment came 6 months after Marcus had begun therapy, during a community program meeting that brought together volunteers from all 12 participating communities. The meeting was being held at Elena's facility to discuss expansion plans and share success stories from the pilot program's first year of operation. Marcus was presenting data on the program's impact, numbers of animals treated, families served, emergency situations resolved, when he realized that his hands were steady and his concentration was clear. The information flowed naturally from his memory, his voice was strong and confident, and his interaction with the audience felt comfortable rather than stressful. It wasn't that his PTSD symptoms had disappeared entirely. He still experienced occasional tremors and anxiety, particularly during high-stress situations or when he was overtired. But the symptoms were manageable now, controlled through a combination of medication, therapy techniques, and lifestyle modifications that allowed him to function effectively even during difficult periods. After the presentation, Elena approached him with the kind of smile that indicated she'd been watching his progress carefully and was pleased with what she observed. "Ready to talk about leading the expansion program?" she asked. Marcus considered the question seriously, assessing his current capabilities against the demands of coordinating a multi-state initiative that would establish community animal care programs throughout the Pacific Northwest. It would require travel, public speaking, coordination with multiple organizations, and the kind of high-level responsibility that had seemed impossible during his darkest periods. But it would also allow him to share the model they'd developed with communities that desperately needed access to affordable animal care, potentially helping thousands of families maintain relationships with beloved companions who might otherwise be surrendered or euthanized due to economic constraints. "I think I'm ready to try," Marcus said finally. The expansion program's launch 6 months later brought Marcus full circle from his beginnings as a homeless veteran, sleeping rough with a pack of stray dogs. The kickoff event was held at a conference center in Seattle, with representatives from rural communities throughout Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Northern California, and Alaska attending to learn about establishing their own animal care networks. Marcus stood at the podium looking out at an audience of veterinarians, social workers, community organizers, and volunteers who shared his commitment to ensuring that economic hardship didn't force people to choose between caring for themselves and caring for their animals. Behind him, a large screen displayed photos from the original pilot program. Dorothy Kellison examining a neighbor's sick cow, Maria providing vaccinations at a community health fair, the Rodriguez family's goats recovering from their respiratory infection. But the image that stayed with him as he began his presentation was one that Dr. Chen had taken without his knowledge during the early days of the program. Marcus kneeling beside an injured dog in a muddy lot, his own appearance showing the effects of months of homelessness, but his attention focused entirely on providing comfort and care to an animal who needed help. 18 months ago, I was sleeping in an abandoned lot with a pack of stray dogs, trying to keep them alive with no resources except whatever I could scavenge or afford for my disability check. Marcus began his presentation. I was broken, angry, and convinced that I had nothing of value to offer the world. He paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected genuine attention and interest rather than pity or condescension. What I learned during that time was that healing doesn't happen in isolation, and that sometimes the most important work we can do is caring for beings who can't care for themselves. The community program we're here to discuss grew out of that simple recognition that people and animals heal better together than they do alone. The presentation continued for an hour, covering the practical details of establishing community volunteer networks, funding strategies, training protocols, and partnership development. But the heart of Marcus's message was about the connections between human and animal welfare, and the way that caring for vulnerable beings could provide purpose and healing for caregivers who were dealing with their own challenges. During the question and answer session, a young woman from rural Alaska raised her hand with an inquiry that took Marcus back to his earliest days working with Elena's mobile veterinary unit. "What do you do when you want to help but feel like you're not qualified, like you don't have enough training or experience to make a real difference?" Marcus smiled, remembering his own doubts and fears when Elena had first offered him the opportunity to coordinate the pilot program. "You start where you are, with what you have, and you learn as you go," he said. "The animals in your community need help right now, not after you've completed years of formal education or accumulated perfect qualifications. What they need is someone who cares enough to try, someone willing to make mistakes and learn from them, someone who understands that caring for others is often the best way to care for yourself." After the conference, Marcus drove back to Portland through countryside that had become familiar during his months coordinating the mobile veterinary unit. The landscape looked different now than it had during his homeless period. Less threatening, more welcoming, full of communities where people he'd trained were providing animal care services that wouldn't have existed otherwise. He stopped at Dorothy Kellison's farm to check on Rusty, who had made a complete recovery from his coyote encounter and was once again serving as Dorothy's devoted companion and protector. Dorothy herself had become the most effective volunteer coordinator in the Eastern Oregon region, training new participants and handling complex cases with the confidence of someone who'd found her true calling later in life. Earl would be proud of what you've accomplished, she told Marcus as they watched Rusty demonstrate his fully healed mobility by chasing a tennis ball across the farmyard. He always said the best way to honor the help you've received is to pass it along to someone else who needs it. Marcus's final stop was at Elena's facility, where he found his original pack of dogs enjoying the comfortable retirement they'd earned through their months of loyalty during his darkest period. Ranger was sleeping in the sunshine near the veterinary hospital, surrounded by Luna's grown puppies who'd chosen to stay near their adoptive uncle rather than finding separate homes. Bear and Duchess were sharing a shady spot beneath an oak tree, their elderly bodies showing the effects of hard living, but their eyes still alert and content. Elena found him there as evening approached, sitting quietly among the dogs who'd been his companions through homelessness and his partners in recovery. "Any regrets about taking on the expansion program?" she asked, settling onto a nearby bench. Marcus considered the question seriously. The new position would require him to travel extensively, work with unfamiliar communities, and manage challenges he couldn't anticipate in advance. His PTSD symptoms were controlled but not eliminated, and there would certainly be difficult days when his psychological condition made leadership more challenging. But there would also be opportunities to prevent other veterans from experiencing the isolation and despair he'd endured, chances to ensure that economic hardship didn't force families to abandon beloved animals, and possibilities for creating support networks that addressed human and animal welfare as interconnected rather than separate issues. "No regrets," Marcus said finally. "Just gratitude for the chance to be useful again." Elena smiled, the expression reflecting satisfaction with outcomes that had exceeded even her ambitious expectations when she'd first hired a homeless veteran to coordinate a community animal care pilot program. As they sat together in the gathering twilight, watching the dogs who'd started Marcus's journey toward recovery, neither spoke about the remarkable transformation that had occurred over the past year and a half. Sometimes the most profound changes happen quietly, through daily choices to care for others despite personal struggles, through decisions to accept help when pride suggested self-sufficiency, through commitment to work that served purposes larger than individual survival. Marcus Rivera had begun his association with Elena Harrison's facility as a desperate man trying to save a dying dog with resources he didn't possess. He was ending this chapter of his story as the director of a regional expansion program that would bring veterinary care to underserved communities throughout the Pacific Northwest, leading an initiative that grew out of his own experience with homelessness and recovery. But the most important transformation was invisible to outside observers. The internal journey from broken veteran to community leader, from someone who needed rescue to someone who could provide it, from isolation and despair to purpose and connection. It had happened gradually, through small daily actions that accumulated into major life changes, through relationships that provided support without demanding perfection, through work that honored both his military training and his civilian recovery. The dogs around him represented not just his past struggles but his future possibilities, companions who'd shared his journey from the streets to stability, and who would continue sharing whatever adventures lay ahead. They'd been with him when he had nothing to offer except determination to survive another day, and they were with him now as he prepared to help other communities build the support networks that had made his own recovery possible. The expansion program would face challenges he couldn't predict and would require adaptations he couldn't plan in advance. But Marcus had learned that healing happened through service to others, that purpose grew from addressing needs larger than personal comfort, and that the most important qualifications for leadership were willingness to care and courage to continue despite imperfection. As the sun set behind the forest surrounding Elena's facility, Marcus Rivera sat surrounded by the animals who'd been his teachers in survival and resilience, planning initiatives that would spread their lessons to communities throughout the region. He'd started as a homeless veteran trying to save a pack of stray dogs, and he'd become something he'd never imagined possible. A leader whose own brokenness had prepared him to help others heal. The story that had begun with desperate improvisation in an abandoned lot was continuing with professional expertise and regional influence. But the heart of it remained unchanged. Sometimes the most important work was simply caring for beings who couldn't care for themselves, and sometimes the people who needed healing most were the ones best positioned to provide it to others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.